I am in Laos, just outside the town of Phon Savan in the Jiangquang province. The Jiangquang province gets its name from the Jiangquang Plateau. That plateau is an area of increased elevation where the plains are 3,000 feet or more and the surrounding mountains are double that. The plateau is home to a site known as the Plain of Jars. The Plain of Jars is an area where thousands of large stone urns or jars are scattered across the plains and hills. Many of these urns date back over 2,000 years. As fascinating as the Plain of Jars site is, I am here in Phon Savan for a very different reason. My reason for being in Phon Savan starts with my brother. I have one brother and he died last year. When my brother was born, he was named after a man named Leslie Sampson. Leslie was from the same hometown in Montana where my father was from. They were friends, they were neighbors. It was one of those small towns where everyone knows everyone else. In March of 1961, Leslie was aboard a United States Air Force airplane that was shot down while flying near the Plain of Jars. On board the plane were 8 servicemen. 7 of the servicemen, including Leslie, died in the crash. It was the very first plane shot down in the Vietnam War. One person miraculously managed to bail out of the plane with a parachute and survived. I am here in Phon Savan to visit the crash site where Leslie and the other servicemen lost their lives. In the mid-morning of March 23, 1961, a United States Air Force C47 Skytrain, nicknamed Rose Bowl, left Vientiane, Laos, headed for Saigon, Vietnam. The crew on board consisted of Ralph Magee, the pilot, Oscar O.B. Weston, co-pilot, Glenn Matteson, navigator, Alfons A. Bankowski, the flight engineer, Frederick Garside, assistant flight engineer, and Leslie Sampson, the radio operator. There were also 2 passengers. They were from the Army Attaché office in Vientiane, Major Lawrence Bob Bailey and Warrant Officer Edgar Weitkamp. The personnel were headed to Saigon for some R&R. Lawrence Bailey, a veteran of World War II and the Korean War, had been a pilot with the Army Air Corps in the South Pacific. He made it a personal habit to always wear a parachute when flying. That personal habit would save his life. When the plane took off from Vientiane, instead of taking a direct route to Saigon, the plane first flew over north-central Laos. At the request of the government of Laos, the flight was to include reconnaissance near the Plain of Jars. At the time, the Soviet Union was conducting large-scale airlifts supplying munitions to the North Vietnamese and communist insurgency known as the Pathet Lao. The C-47 was specially equipped with reconnaissance equipment and was trying to determine the radio frequencies that the Soviet pilots used to locate their airfield. The narrative that I'm about to provide regarding the flight comes from a combination of eyewitness accounts and from interviews with Lawrence Bailey. As the plane flew near the town of Phon Savan in a northwest direction, it passed near the Phon Savan airstrip located here. Twin-barrel 37mm anti-aircraft guns and 12.7mm machine guns mounted on armored cars, manned by 4 or 5 Vietnamese soldiers, located here and here, fired approximately 40 rounds at the aircraft. As the plane continued on, it encountered additional fire and was hit approximately here. Aboard the aircraft, Bailey was seated near the rear of the plane. An experienced pilot himself, over the sound of the engines, he heard the pop, pop, pop of the anti-aircraft fire. Looking out the windows, he saw flames coming out of the right wing. Quoting Bailey now, he yelled out, "We're hit! Bail out!" Major Bailey was the only individual wearing a parachute. As the rest of the crew moved past Bailey to affix chutes to the rigging, Bailey found the emergency door, which was already opened, and he flung himself out. A third burst of anti-aircraft fire hit the plane approximately here. Black smoke emerged, and the plane spiraled down in flames. Bailey landed with a harsh impact and was stunned. When his head cleared, he found himself in a field with buffalo grazing nearby. Off in the distance, he saw the column of smoke from the crash. As Bailey tried to stand, he realized he was severely injured and was in no condition to try to make it to the crash site. Pathet Lao forces soon captured Bailey, and they took him to a hospital in Phon Savon. He was then transferred to Sam Nua, a town on the Vietnam border. He was imprisoned in solitary confinement in an unlit room for 17 months. Lawrence Bailey was the first prisoner of war in Southeast Asia to be captured after the Geneva Agreements of 1954. Over the next 2 days, the U.S. received reports in Vientiane that the plane had been shot down, that Bailey had been captured, and that the 7 other servicemen died in the crash. By June, the U.S. had interviewed individuals that had witnessed the shooting of the airplane. The Pathet Lao acknowledged that they had captured Bailey, but they declined all requests from the U.S. and third parties to interview Bailey or to visit the crash site and retrieve any remains. First-hand verification of the deaths of the 7 servicemen was not possible. The initial status of the 7 servicemen was missing in action. In March of 1962, based on numerous reports with matching details, and in part because no evidence of survival existed, a determination and report of death was issued for the 7 men. Their status became killed in action, body not recovered. Bailey was released following an agreement in August of 1962. The Pathet Lao continued to deny any party to visit the crash or recover any remains. Even after the war ended, the Pathet Lao, renamed as Lao People's Revolutionary Party, took control of the government in Laos in 1975. They continued to refuse access to the site and the recovery of the remains. When Bailey was released, it was the first time that the U.S. could get a first-hand account of the crash from U.S. personnel. Bailey was able to provide details about the flight, the anti-aircraft fire, miraculously parachuting, being captured, and his detainment. But Bailey wasn't at the site. He only saw smoke from a distance. He presumed that all of the others had died in the crash, but he wasn't there. For family and friends of the 7 servicemen, it was the beginning of 3 decades of uncertainty. Many stories of servicemen surviving crashes, being held as prisoner of war, many stories of servicemen avoiding capture and being aided by villagers, and even different accounts of the crash indicating that more than one person was able to parachute, all fueled the uncertainty that left families and friends frustrated and desperately desiring the information, good or bad, that would bring closure. In July of 1991, 30 years after the crash, a team from the USA visited the crash site. 7 grave sites were near the crash site, remains were found in 4 of the graves. 3 of the graves had been previously excavated and the remains were no longer present. In November of 1991, the remains of Ralph Magee, Glenn Matteson, Frederick Garside, and Leslie Sampson were positively identified. To this day, the remains of Edgar Weitkamp, Oscar Weston, and Alfons Bankowski have not been recovered. The crash was the very first American aircraft shot down in the Vietnam War. The deaths of these 7 servicemen were among the very earliest casualties in the Vietnam War. At the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., the names on the wall are mostly in chronological order based on the date of death. The names of these 7 men, including Leslie, are the 4th through the 10th names listed on the first panel starting at 1 east of the memorial. The shooting of this plane was an absolute proverbial seminal moment for the insurgency. So much so that in 1968, the Pathet Lao started issuing their own currency. They called their currency the Liberty Kip, and it was printed in China. The back of the 500 kip note was the scene of soldiers shooting down a plane on the plain of Jars. Prior to traveling to Laos, I did considerable research on the internet. My initial hope was to find someone in the Phone Savant area that was familiar with the crash site that could take me there. I need to explain a little bit about the crash site though. This is not a tourist site. There's no memorial marker, there's no signage, there's no indication along the road somewhere that this is the crash site. In fact, it's the exact opposite. This is a place with history, a history of the government not allowing people to go there, and a history of local villagers wanting to be compensated for information about the crash site and the location of the remains. So for me to make inquiries and want to go to this site as an individual, it's a bit delicate. Other than the recovery team that was there in the early 1990s and the servicemen who were on the plane, I think it's highly unlikely that any other American has ever been to this crash site. I made a number of inquiries to tour agencies in the Phone Savant area, and I delicately inquired about a crash from 1961. I got several responses back about other sites and places they could take me, but nothing about a crash from 1961. In the process of making these inquiries, though, I came across another individual. They responded back to me with, "Do you have the GPS coordinates of the site?" I provided them with the GPS coordinates, and they got back to me with, I'll quote, "I think I can take you there." This person was an experienced trekker in Laos and the surrounding region. They were familiar with the Jiangquang province, and very importantly, they had experience with unexploded ordnances. The Jiangquang province was the site of many battles during the war in Laos. There are unexploded ordnances from mortars and from shoulder-fired equipment and from aerial bombs. You simply do not go trekking off trail in the Phone Savant area without risking coming into contact with unexploded ordnances. This person was the perfect guide to take me to the site. We started exchanging communication and we came up with a plan of how to go to the site and when we could both be in Phone Savant. I also want to share my expectations in visiting this site. This plane crashed over 60 years ago, and the recovery of the remains of 4 of the servicemen was over 30 years ago. The areas around the crash site have been turned into farmland, the natural vegetation is no longer there, and there are buildings in the area now that were not there at the time of the crash. Villagers salvaged the plane over the years and melted it down to make pots and spoons and other items. I'm not expecting to find anything at the crash site. My expectation is to simply visit the place where these men lost their lives. I traveled to Font-Sauvant and I met up with the guide. The guide was in Font-Sauvant before I was, and they did some pre-scouting of the areas around the coordinates. I mentioned before that visiting the site was a bit delicate. To reach the site, we needed to adhere to a couple of things. The first was we needed to stick to publicly accessible routes. We did not want to trespass on any privately owned or controlled land. The second thing was that we didn't want to draw any attention to ourselves. The last thing that either of us wanted was to have any sort of encounter that resulted in us being questioned or detained by the authorities. In looking at the areas around the GPS coordinates, it appeared that we would be able to reach the site by hiking along the river. While doing some pre-scouting of the area, the guide discovered a dirt road. When we arrived at this dirt road, there was a gate and it was closed. We decided not to use this dirt road. We didn't want to risk an issue of trespass. We drove back in the direction that we came from and looked at other sites along the river. This was one of the sites that we considered. From this site here, we could work our way down this right bank and then cross over on that footbridge and then follow the river down to the site. This place here would allow us to park well off the road, but the disadvantage here was it was considerably further than that first dirt road that we looked at. We decided to drive back to the area of that first dirt road, and we drove past. We took a side road between some government farmland, and we discovered this dirt road here. This road wasn't on the maps, but looking at satellite shots, it appeared to go fairly close to the river. We parked the vehicle and we hiked down this road. You can see on the sides of this road that there are pine trees. After hiking down this road for a ways, we saw a clearing in the pine trees, and looking at satellite shots, it appeared to cut directly towards the river. We cut through the trees, and we popped out at this field. Following across that field, we eventually reached a place where we could start to see the river. Between where we're standing in this photo here and that hillside over there, there's a bit of a stream that cuts through here that feeds the river. We went off to the left, and then we found a place to cross over the water. When we got to the other side, before that stand of trees that was shown in the earlier picture, there were a few cattle that took interest in our walking across that field. We walked through the stand of trees that I showed in that earlier picture. When we got through that stand of trees, we were at the edge of the hill, and down below us we could see the river. It's hard to tell it in this picture, but there's actually an oxbow or a bit of a U-turn here in the river. Our plan was to go to the left here and cross over this stream that fed the river, and then follow the fence line down to the river's edge and then up to where the GPS coordinates are. We didn't know it at the time, but in this photo right here, between this shed here and that tree, on the opposite side of this hill facing the river is where the GPS coordinates are for the crash site. Had we known that, we probably wouldn't have gone all the way to the river's edge. We probably would have elected to cross the fence line and follow the back edge of this property around the back side of that shed to get to where we're going. We found a place to cross the stream that fed into the river, and then we followed that fence line up to the river's edge. It's hard to tell in this shot here, but this is a pretty steep drop-off that we needed to get down to be at the edge of the river. This is the view of that river edge after we came down from the top. I pointed my camera upwards and took this picture. If this dirt looks like it's freshly disturbed, it's because it was. Immediately prior to taking this picture, I skidded down the face of that embankment. Up the trail just a few yards, I snapped this photo. I didn't realize it at the time, but right up here where the trail turns back is directly below the GPS coordinates. From the location that I showed in that last photo, we worked our way along the edge of the river and onto this area over here, and then crossed over that area and up this hillside. The spot where I took this photo right here is 20 to 30 feet above the GPS coordinate of the crash site. I'm going to switch to a satellite view here. This satellite image is from December 2023. When I took this photo here, in the satellite shot, I am right about here. And that is right above the GPS coordinates of the crash site. The GPS coordinates of the crash site are expressed in degrees, minutes, and seconds. And at this latitude, that level of accuracy would be within 100 feet or so. In addition to the GPS coordinates, I also had a couple of military grid coordinates, and I plotted both of those. They are here and here. These military grid coordinates at that level of precision are within 100 meters. So roughly the length of an American football field plus an end zone or a soccer field. So if you can imagine a 100-meter square here, that is the area we're talking about when using the military coordinates. The thing about all three of these coordinates, though, is all of them were accompanied with this statement, in the vicinity of. All three of these pin locations shown on the satellite photo here are in the vicinity of each other. So I don't know the exact pinpoint spot where the plane impacted the ground. I just know that this is the area. And then just for size reference, I'm going to superimpose a C47 plane on this. And this is only for size reference, and this is to scale. So if you can imagine that at that GPS location, that's where the plane actually hit, you can see that it would take up all of the area where I was standing previously. Back to this photo here. Where I took this photo, I am standing just a few feet above the GPS location of the crash site. The military grid points would be about here in the photo and about here. I will tell you that while we were doing our pre-scouting of the area, we looked at the property on the other side of the river. This is a view of that property from the road on the other side. It didn't look like to us that there was any opportunity here for us to reach the river through this property. This water that's shown here in this picture is not the river. This is simply a private reservoir or stock water that is on the land. The river is back a ways and not visible in this picture. While I was here, I took a short selfie video to show the area and to talk a little bit. So I'm here at the crash site, and this literally is, I'll scroll behind me so you can see behind me, this is at the kind of the crest of a hill coming up off of a river, and it's right at the edge of the hill here where the GPS shows the crash site was. If I move around, you can see behind me there's now a fence and a bit of a rice field here. So if the plane made the crest of the hill, it's no longer visible. We've walked this whole area and we're not able to see any visible scars. But according to the GPS, I literally am standing just a few feet from where the GPS marker was, where this spot was. There's a ravine down below us, and so if the plane hit in the ravine, that's really not, it's very difficult to walk down that and look for any scars, but there's a lot of vegetation, it'd be difficult anyway. And then if it made the crest of the hill, it was up here, that's the edge of farmland now. So there doesn't appear to be any visible evidence here anymore of the actual crash. As we got closer, it was, we watched the GPS on our phones and we realized that we were here. And then looking at landmarks across the river and stuff like that, we were able to determine that this is where it was. And it fits the description of the personal accounts in terms of the nearness to the river and the fact that they said that over a number of years that bits of the plane were brought down the hill. That was their description. So this is the site. And then here's just a little bit of video that I took right at the crest of the hill, directly above those GPS coordinates. In 1961, there likely would have been trees here. And if you're wondering how I could possibly know that, it's because of this tree here. This tree was not here in 1961. And I know that because it's growing in a bomb crater. This tree grew after this area was bombed. This tree would not have been planted here. It grew there naturally. And that's why I suggest that there would have been trees here, because the seeds to start this tree were already in the area and it grew naturally. This is the area where the C47 crashed and the 7 servicemen lost their lives. To leave the crash site area, we did not drop back down to the river. Instead, we walked behind that tin shed along the edge of the property, and we came out back here, crossed the fence here, and then worked our way back the way we came. For those family members and friends of the servicemen, I want to share a few photos and talk a bit about the Fon-Savon area to provide a sense of the area where these men lost their lives. The current population of Fon-Savon is estimated to be around 37,000. In 1961, it would have been a small fraction of that. Fon-Savon is an isolated town. There are 2 main roads going into Fon-Savon. Outside of the town, these roads are not good. It is 10 hours from Vientiane to Fon-Savon on the bus. Most of what is modern-day Fon-Savon was built after 1978. Fon-Savon is now the capital seat of the province of Jiangquang. The province seat used to be in Weitkamp, but during the war, Weitkamp was nearly destroyed. And so in the late 70s, the capital of the province was moved from Weitkamp to Fon-Savon. None of these buildings in these photos would have existed in 1961. Aside from some of the small businesses that you see in these photos, the main source of income for the inhabitants of the province are agricultural, farming and livestock production. The rice that is grown here is still planted and harvested by hand. In addition to agriculture, there are some mining activities in the nearby mountains. Most of the residents buy their groceries and their supplies at open-air markets. There are very few modern grocery stores in Fons-Savant. Housing in the Fons-Savant area is shifting towards more modern housing like you see here. This is what the housing would have looked like though in 1961. This is a traditional Lao home. You can see that it's elevated here. In addition to traditional structures that are elevated, you also have structures that are built right on the ground. And this is simply because Fons-Savant is a bit of a hilly area. It's not a lowland area that is quite so prone to flooding. So here you see an older structure that would have existed in 1961, and then a more modern home built directly behind it on the same lot. This picture here I took probably about 10 miles outside of the town of Fons-Savant. It really represents a good cross-section of what the structures would have been like in 1961. You have structures that are built directly on the ground like this, and then you have the traditional elevated ones like you see here. The areas around Fons-Savant are a mixture of plains and foothills, and then off in the distance you have the mountains. In this picture here, I'm actually at what is known as Site 1 of the Plain of Jars, and I'm looking back towards the town of Fons-Savant. The new airport is over here, and you can see the edge of this here is actually a stone jar. These are jars on the Plain of Jars. And so that's a quick look at kind of the area around Fons-Savant. During the narrative, I showed a picture of the airplane. This is the actual plane. A research assistant at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, produced a digital copy of this photo for me from a slide that is part of the Roger Lee Miller Aviation collection in their Special Collections repository. I am very grateful for their assistance in helping me obtain this photo. I am not aware of the existence of any other photo of this plane prior to the crash. This photo is undated, but based on the collection dates, it is presumed to be between 1959 and 1960. This photo was taken at the Osan Air Force Base in South Korea. The flight crew on the plane were from the Osan Air Base. The insignia on the tail of the plane is the insignia of the 67th Tactical Reconnaissance Wing. This is what that insignia looks like. From what I was able to determine online, this wing was activated in Korea in 1951 and flew reconnaissance missions during the Korean War. It was inactivated in December of 1960. I do not know whether or not the plane still had the insignia at the time of the crash in March of 1961. But the insignia in the photo is a clear indication that this plane was used for reconnaissance. Lawrence Bailey weighed just 117 pounds when he was released in August of 1962. After full recovery, he continued an extraordinary military career and later retired with the rank of colonel. He wrote a book about the crash and his confinement. The book is titled Solitary Survivor, the First American POW in Southeast Asia. In the description area below this video, I have included a link to that book at Amazon. The last part of the title is The First American POW in Southeast Asia. I want to point out that there were earlier POWs in Southeast Asia. Lawrence Bailey is the first military prisoner of war of record in the Vietnam War. but there were earlier POWs. There were 5 U.S. servicemen, 3 from the Air Force and 2 from the Army, that were captured near Da Nang, Vietnam in June 1954. The circumstances are dramatically different. They were captured while driving a French military vehicle they had borrowed to go swimming. They were released 2.5 months later in August of 1954. This is during the time of the first Geneva Agreement, which was signed in July of 1954. This is often regarded as the end of what is known as the First Indochina War. And for that reason, their capture is sometimes not considered to be part of the Vietnam War. If you look at the complete history of North Vietnam, the Viet Minh, the Indochina Communist Party, and those organizations that they created and controlled, there is no point in time between the end of World War II and 1975 when they are not actively engaged in the overthrow of all of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And for that reason, I think it's appropriate to consider these 5 men as the first POWs of the Vietnam War. Lawrence Bailey is the first prisoner of war following the Geneva Accords of 1954, and he most certainly is the first to have been shot down and taken prisoner of war. There are a couple of things related to my narrative of the crash that I want to draw attention to. I'm drawing attention to these items because there are a number of comments and narratives on the internet related to both this crash and other events of the Vietnam War that are not wholly accurate. It's not that they are deliberately inaccurate. Some underlying presumptions have been made that have led to incorrect perceptions and narratives. It's a measure of respect to those that served and lost their lives that we know the truth and that we share the truth. The first is this. When I talked about the positions of the anti-aircraft guns, I displayed the words Vietnamese soldiers. That part of my narrative came from the very first eyewitness account that was taken in Vientiane. The man that gave that account was a Laos citizen living in Phon Savan at the time of the crash. He was a person with previous military experience. He was able to identify positions on military maps, estimate the altitude of the plane, provide details of the arms used, and of the personnel that manned those arms. He was very articulate. When he said that they were Vietnamese soldiers, he knew what he was talking about. He was from the community of Phon Savan, Laos. They were soldiers from Vietnam. In materials that had been declassified, it was revealed that there was a communication intercepted on the same day of the crash between the Pathet Lao 2nd Battalion and their command. They reported that they shot down an American C-47. That communication went to Hanoi in Vietnam. These were Vietnamese soldiers, and they were not, by any stretch of definition, guerrillas. The second thing that I want to draw attention to is in relation to the area where this happened. In interviews, Lawrence Bailey recalled that during his descent, he saw brown-green grazing land. When he was fully conscious on the ground, he saw buffalo grazing. Some of the narratives online include references to planes that were lost in the jungles of Laos. So first, this is not a jungle area. And second, this plane was not lost. The Pathet Lao went to the crash site. They removed the bodies from the wreckage and they buried them nearby. They took photos of the wreckage, photos of the bodies, and photos of identification materials of the servicemen. These photos were used in Pathet Lao propaganda films. 4 photos from the Central Army Museum in Hanoi show identification materials and personal documents of these servicemen. 13 photos from the Vietnam News Agency in Hanoi show the wreckage and human remains. The Vietnam News Agency is run by the government of Vietnam. It is the official state news agency for Vietnam and the Communist Party of Vietnam. There is also a photo of Souphanouvong reviewing these materials. He was the man who became the first president of the government that the Pathet Lao installed in 1975. Over the years, local villagers visited the crash site and they scavenged the wreckage for salvage. The location of the crash and the burial site of the remains were always known to the Pathet Lao, the government that they installed in 1975, and the local villagers. This plane was not lost, and there was nothing that prevented the Pathet Lao or the government that they installed from allowing the U.S. or even third parties to visit the crash site and retrieve the remains of the deceased servicemen. For any family or friends of the servicemen that died, if you would really like to contact me, I have a website. My website is flyingpuma.com, and on my website I have a link to contact me. It is in both the menu and in the quick links. And if you go to the contact me page, there's a form to fill out. Fill in your first and last name and your email address and send me a short message. It is important that if you use this that you check the box that says yes, I'm human, and uncheck the box that says no, I am not human. If you don't do that, I will never receive the message. I have a link to my website, flyingpuma.com, in the description below this video.